Um, so there are a lot of different frameworks for thinking about how to lead change. I want to note two of my main sources. The first is called Leading Change by Harold Cotter, and it's a classic book from professor in Harvard, which just talks about leading change in the context of organizations. And certainly, he is describing leading change in a very large organizations, but as I hope you will see in this presentation, there's definitely applicability to smaller congregations and local faith communities as well. And the second source that a lot of this is drawn from is a manual, or actually a training that I attended, put on by the group Interaction Associates, and they specialize in leading change in what is described as collaborative networks, which is a good way of describing the church. A church is a collaborative network. There are lots of people, multiple stakeholders, lots of different opinions. People are bound not by employment, but actually by a sense of commitment to and sense of and faith. And so that requires a special kind of leadership and a special kind of thinking whenever you're talking about leading change. Um, there are three main parts to this presentation, as you can see, starting off with determining an area of change and generating urgency about it, building a shared vision of where headed, and building a working group to then accomplish this vision. There, there are lots of parts of a change process that aren't included in this, obviously. One of the four that really is kind of impossible to describe in an hour is communicating the vision more widely. Um, and before we jump into the meat of the presentation, what I want to just begin with is a description of some of the premises that I'm starting from. The first premise is that leading change in the church necessarily involves working with the wider community. Uh, you know, change agents may sometimes feel like they're acting as solo members, but and in some cases, in other types of organizations, that may be appropriate. In the context of a church, especially where people are bound by a sense of commitment, really, if you're leading major change, you have to be doing it with others. The second premise has to do with the difference between authority and leadership. Many have pointed out that rectors, for instance, have the canonical authority to make certain unilateral decisions, and that is absolutely true in the canonical sense. And there is a difference. So, having said that, there is a difference between having the authority to do something and then doing something as a leader. Um, Sometimes, if leading change means a unilateral decision, the danger is that you'll turn around and see that no one has followed you along the path, and that's a problem of leadership. And then the last bit has to do with um, how developing a sense of awareness um, around yourself as a change agent. Um, we need to, all of us, I think, need to develop the ability to recognize when we're getting out too far ahead of others. And we need to pause and be able to, commit to the work of bringing others along. So if you have a crystal clear notion, if you and you alone have a crystal clear notion of what absolutely needs to happen right now for your congregation to be healthy and vital, I would invite you to just take a deep breath and be willing to let a little bit of that go and open up your concern to the wider community, because in the wider community there are going to be people who have some really great ideas And they're probably things that you haven't thought about yet. So this is a lot of leading change is really about expressing your concern and then inviting the strategies and creativity of others. Okay, so with all those caveats, talk about determining an area of change and generating urgency around the need for change. Any organization, congregations as well, can be basically divided into three areas. There's the organizational level, which will, and at the very top of the organizational level, it's questions of purpose, of mission, of vision, and identity. There's a programmatic level, which obviously connects to your feeding ministries, your youth programs. Literally, oftentimes we just describe them as programs. And then there's the operational level. Any changes related to building, staffing, volunteer policies, or administration. I would just ask you to think to yourself, if you're going to be leading a major change, or if you are leading a major change at this moment, in which area generally does this fall? Is this a question of finding a sense of purpose, of knowing where you're going to be in 20 years? Is this about ending a program that maybe isn't serving the purpose that it was originally intended for? So just looking at this, what I want to do now is help us identify, let's practice identifying, just for fun, where certain kinds of changes would fall. So Brendan, I'm wondering if you can bring up the first question. So this is a change that's happening in many congregations. Congregations are facing the difficult reality of needing to go from a full-time to part-time clergy person. And I just ask you, what kind of change is this? We have 4 of 6, so that's a pretty good response rate. Okay. I would argue that in so much as it relates to staffing, directly to staffing, it's an operational change. Now, obviously, this change impacts every other part of the organization, and that's why it is a major change. The reason why I would say it's not an organizational change is because from the standpoint of a congregation, as much as we value our clergy can come and go, but the mission and vision and identity of a place is should be, in a healthy way, separate from the particular identity of a clergy person. Now, clearly, there are instances in which that's not necessarily the case. I've been a part of a congregation in which the identity was entirely wrapped up in a clergy person's personality, and so when they left, it was pretty devastating. But one of the things we really hope for is that congregations have a sense of identity, have a sense of mission and vision that is facilitated by the clergy person and not dependent on it. So let's go to the second question. My favorite question of them all. Where do you think a change in worship service would fall? These are also tricky questions. I intentionally chose some tricky questions. Okay, so that's 3 people. I'm wondering if we can get a few more folks to respond. I would argue, and I'm willing to be told wrong, I'm incorrect on this, organizational. Um, Remember that organizational change, it has to do with purpose, with mission, with vision, with identity. There is, in many, many cases, there is, I would say most cases, there is nothing so core to the identity and sense of mission of a congregation as its worship service, and that's what as its worship service, right? And that's um, that's why the decision to uh, you know remove some pews in the back of the church or use the clay pots as opposed to the silver materials is experienced as such a shock in many places, because we're talking immediately, once you're talking about worship, about the core aspects of, um, of the identity of a congregation. Think, for instance, as well about the music, changing the music, or trying to get a new musician is a process that is really oftentimes really core to who a congregation considers itself to be. Kathy brings up to the point, might it uh, depend on the kind of change? Um, what Certainly, I mean, clearly, yes. I'm wondering if we can think of a change in worship that would be not necessarily as related to the kind of core identity um, of a congregation. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to ask our third question. And this is just about some, self-reflection, and also a question of what um, brings you here tonight. Of all the things that need to change in your congregation, and you may have a lengthy list, what do you feel you, what is the area that you feel you most need a significant change? And once you have identified that, I think if you could, if you'd be willing to enter into the chat box, just describe that for us. What kind of, go into a little bit more detail.
What are we doing?
If you could, in your case, Trinity, it might be a little bit more difficult since there's a group of folks. But if you feel quite strongly that there's a particular change that's needed, or that you want to begin, I just ask you to describe that for us in the chat box. Take a moment to do that.
Tell me something.
We're all here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
well, I wrote, we are in the place of strengthening existing programs and operational level changes relating to strengthening
What someone just described in the chat box is very common whenever we ask congregations kind of what have you most needed in the past 6 months, what are you needing the most in the next 6 months. Oftentimes at the very top of the list is a sense of purpose, which is really, I think, a really striking thing that congregations need. A lot of congregations, maybe yours, really need to do some of that identity work around defining mission and vision, and naming why does our congregation exist as opposed to the congregation across the street, which is a Lutheran church. What is it that's Episcopal about us, for instance? Trinity,
I think we almost identify.
changing how vestry functions and communicates.
I think, like we're strengthening our mentoring program. I think.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's a more programmatic change, right? It doesn't, Kathy,
Yes.
it doesn't necessarily go, isn't experienced as a very, uh, I'm thinking of the Spanish word, which is choque, which is like a crash or a shock to the system when you make those changes. There's just a final note on this piece, which is we may all have a list of 5 or 6 things that, or more, of major changes that we would like to see happen in our congregation. What I want to just note is the wisdom of some change experts like William Bridges, who note that collaborative networks, collaborative systems like a church really can bear only one major change or 2 major changes at most at a time. So once you start making 3 or 4 or 5 major changes all at once, a sense of you're really starting to eat away at the identity of a place, at the commitment levels that are what bind people together. People no longer know what they're showing up to anymore. So there is a patience that has to be a part of leading a major change process. Okay, so let's, for the sake of moving forward, let's say that you have identified your area of major change, and as just continuing with the example that I started, let's say it's what is happening in many places, the need to go from an operational change, the need to go from a full-time to a part-time clergy person. And so you know that right now there needs to be some really honest conversations about the financial situation in your congregation, and there needs to be some problem solving about what to do about this. The first rule in terms of leading a major change that comes from David Cotter, and I think it's absolutely true, is never underestimate the power of inertia. Not only do people not want to change, but they really, really, really don't want to change. And as a change agent, as someone who is wanting to have these conversations, you should never forget that it's going to be an uphill battle. So spend a little bit of time thinking, what are the sources of inertia, of resistance to change in my particular context? Cotter has a great short list of common sources of inertia. The absence of a visible crisis. We know, until the roof has fallen in, we're not going to fix it. The problem with waiting until the roof falls in is that then all your resources, time, energy, money, are devoted to fixing the roof. And it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. A rich, successful, and storied past, the golden age. Too many visible symbols that all is well. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. I'll say in New York, there are some. I've been in parishes that are in dire financial straits. But if you attend the worship service and if you go to coffee hour, there's beautiful china, there's all the wonderful, beautiful accoutrements of a wealthy past. And that's fine, but we need to be aware of the symbols that we're, of the symbolism that we're communicating. Are we saying inadvertently that everything's fine and wonderful when in fact, maybe not so much? Certainly honest feedback. I've heard of congregations where the parish administrator has never used a computer, and they're struggling to have conversations about that. So that's a culture in which honest feedback hasn't occurred, and too many messages from leaders indicating that everything is okay. So again, a quick question just for you to be thinking about. What are some sources of inertia in your congregation? And so the first then step is if the first step is knowing that never underestimating source of inertia, the second step is going to be generating urgency. Generating urgency around just the mere fact that something needs to change. And really the first point here, stop saying that everything is okay, become much more honest about problems, could be, is basically the underlying principle of all the ones that follow. And I'm wondering if, Brendan, you can share a story from your own experience on this.
Yeah, in the parish that I had been working at, the I was the administrator, and I worked, with many different areas of the congregation. The going back to 2008, 2009, when the Great Recession hit, of course, our congregation was impacted, as were many churches experiencing the fallout from the financial crisis. For us, it was over time and leading up to the stewardship campaign when working with the stewardship committee in 2009. The prior 3 months, we lost just over $40,000 worth of pledging for that fiscal year, and we were having to figure out what to do for stewardship for the following year, and how we're going to figure out our budget not only for the current fiscal year, but of course for 2010 as well. Again, not an uncommon situation that numerous congregations experienced, unfortunately. We were able to come to strike a balance in still maintaining a positive focus on the great strides that our congregation had made in our mission and ministry. But we discussed this a lot in that committee, but also amongst the staff as well, about being honest with the reality that we were facing. And particularly at the staff, with the clergy and staff of the congregation, we were checking in on this on a regular basis in our check-ins about sort of how things were presenting, because while we did not want to send everybody into chaos, the fact that our impulse was to protect. We want to protect our congregation from what's bad and what's out there, and we want to be able to reassure and be a comfort to everybody. But you can also do just as much damage by sheltering people off from that's everything's fine, when it's really not. So particularly in this case of working with the stewardship committee, we're able to strike the balance of still being able to take the celebratory tone of that we've done some great things. We had just come off of a great year where we had increased our budget significantly and had managed to do some really great work, but struck it with an aspirational budget still, asking people who could step up their giving and were able to do so to please be able to do so, but it was still an aspirational budget on a reduced budget. And we were honest with that we were going to be tightening our belts in, but we're still going to weather this through, and it was still going to be, we're great family and great ministry and great programs together, even given the circumstances. When it came down to some of those bits and bobs and actually implementing it, though, for example, the promotional brochures and pledge cards that go out. So we decided that this was going to be all produced in-house, all this was going to be done, and when it came time to doing for printing, a couple people in there wanted to, we should just go ahead and we should print this out in color on nice paper with the printer like we always had for all those years. Otherwise, what are people going to think? And I had to go with the rector and consult a little bit, and really we had to push back and make a point that no, we really needed to make sure that this is going to be done in-house. Maybe it's not going to look as nice, and that's a good thing. so that even people who aren't going to take the time to really read the message that was going to be said in the letter or in any of our literature, were going to be forced to notice that things were different. This was not the same sort of, literature that we were sending out in years past. We were trying to be as frugal as possible while still having the lovely photos and our usual sets of sort of diagrams that we like to put into our campaign literature. And it worked. People were talking about it afterwards, and after that mailing went out. And overall, that was a good thing because people did pay attention. They took notice of this. So that's just to illustrate an example of sort of a looming issue, but wanting to resist the urge to shelter off while also beginning to implement the changes that we had to on a much tighter fiscal reality for the congregation.
Great, thank you. Another example that I just want to share is from a priest in the Diocese of Virginia who I've spoken to, and this is just following up on the kind of full-time, part-time sort of question. Basically, what had happened with her is that a few years ago, the congregation had gone from full-time to part-time with the understanding that over the next few years, they would really commit to an operational change. So see first bullet one. They would make a significant effort over the next few years to grow the annual operating budget. And one of the things that in going from full-time to half-time, one of the things, very kind things that this priest decided to do was continue to serve every Sunday at this congregation and preside at the Eucharist every Sunday. So what she would do is she would, just limit the number of hours that she worked during the week, but she was there every Sunday, and in fact she would then drive over to another congregation and would do their service immediately afterwards. So a very well-intentioned, very common thing that half-time clergy do. But over time what she realized is that she was sapping then, by doing so, she was sapping any sense of urgency around the need to rebuild the annual operating budget. Because for the vast majority of the congregation's members, nothing had actually changed. In fact, they were getting a full-time priest apparently for half the cost, because the clergy person was there every single Sunday. But what that also didn't reveal, what that also hid, was the fact that a lot of programming had been cut, and because oftentimes our congregation's members are not necessarily the recipients of our programming, of some programming, they may not be the person who was identified or who recognized that this change had happened. So in order to build urgency, what this priest was considering was only presiding at the Eucharist every other Sunday for this congregation, because suddenly then it really starts to hit home, and that's, if we're going to lead change, it really needs to hit home within the wider community that a change is needed. So that kind of going back to the little list, the bullet points of how do we create a sense of urgency, you want to be thinking and acting in ways to where it hits home for the vast majority of the congregation. In the same way that Brendan described, even just a simple change of not doing a color, annual appeal, but black and white, conveying that something has changed dramatically.
And just to add, that especially in Miguel's example, when you're making bold moves, there inevitably is going to be a degree of pushback that you're going to be facing, and that especially if people aren't on board with that. That's inevitably, and I'm sure many of you have encountered those situations when people are resisting, that's the case. But there's also going to be people who will be excited about that, and that's we're going to be moving into sort of looking at the next steps to find and harness the energy behind those people that when some of these changes are occurring, and there's some excitement and a little glitter in the eyes of some people when they're seeing some of that change too, to be able to really be able to harness that and to be able to use that energy as a way to move you forward.
Great. And just so that Brendan, you and I are aware, we need a we're at 7:38, so we have a significant. We'll try to speed up just a little bit. So again, identifying an area of change, building a sense of urgency. The next step is you want to root your change in a positive vision. And in order to do that, you want to gather some of the key stakeholders within the congregation to discern with you, collectively discern with you, where are we headed with all of this. So people oftentimes use the word stakeholders, and I want to just spend a little bit of a moment defining what that means. If you look on the left-hand column of this, there are 4 categories of stakeholders, and this comes from Interaction Associates. Those ultimately responsible for decisions. I give some examples here. Those who implement or prevent implementation of a decision. Those who will be directly affected by the outcome of the decision. Oftentimes you're going to want to, you will want to have a way of communicating a major decision and getting feedback from the wider congregation, whether it's a forum or just coffee hour conversations. And then those who have information and expertise. So just a few notes on this chart. The change in the location of coffee hour, that was an actual experience from me, from a congregation I was part of, and they moved coffee hour from point A to point B, and the vestry approved it. The rector thought it was a great idea. In fact, the whole congregation thought it was a great idea, but they didn't check with the people who had been running and being the volunteers for coffee hour for the past 30 years. So these are the people who implement the decision as well as prevent implementation. So in failing to do so, those wonderful volunteers went on strike. And suddenly it became the rector's job to set up and take down coffee hour. And it became very apparent that a key step was missed in who they're supposed to be engaging. In a broad effort to grow annual operating budgets, it's going to involve a lot of people. The last category, those who have information and expertise, there may be folks in your congregation who think about development and think about fundraising specifically. And you will, in some form or fashion, even if it's just with a side conversation, want to bring them in. They will feel honored, I think, to be brought in as well into that conversation. The point of having these conversations is to develop a vision of what the church and world will look like once this major change has been accomplished. Sometimes the major change may be negative. So for instance, I know of congregations that feel that they need to hire a new organist, for instance, or let go of their current position. The importance of emphasizing the positive in that case would be, what are the opportunities, what are the musical varieties that we're not able to hear at this moment? What is the world out there that we haven't yet entered into? So finding ways of rooting even hard, very difficult changes in a positive vision is going to be really important. vision, having a vision is key in simply aligning and inspiring people throughout. So what we recommend is to engage your stakeholder groups, literally create a list of who needs. Sounds obvious, but it's not actually obvious. I'd encourage you to think about the 80-20 rule in those conversations. The 80-20 rule is the other person should be talking 80% of the time, you should be speaking 20% of the time. So asking open-ended questions, asking them for feedback, and trying to listen across all these conversations for what are some common aspects of where this change is going to lead us to. Okay. And as an example of a team framing a vision of change, I want to, I don't know if Trinity, you're familiar with St. Luke's in Cleveland, Ohio. I hope you are. The rector there, David Bargetzi, has led a really, really interesting change process over the course of the past 14 years. So, in 2000, the congregation, this congregation was like many congregations in the Episcopal Church in that the members looked radically different than the rest of the neighborhood that it was in. And they brought on David Bargetzi, knowing that they wanted to reflect more the neighborhood, to be incorporated in fact a neighborhood church and all that that means. So there was a clear sense of the change that needed to happen. It was organizational change, sense of identity, and there was a sense of urgency around it. So what they did was David assembled a visioning team, and they went around to the neighborhood and started to do classic needs assessment. What do you need from this place? And over time, a vision of what the church would look like began to emerge. And they did a lot of great work. It was, they hit all the stakeholder categories, including, including asking the people who would be affected by this change, which is the neighborhood and the congregation members. What makes them different, though, and what I would really encourage you to think about, is that then David and this team spent a lot of time with the people who had been members of the congregation for many, many years, just literally visualizing what the practicalities of what would happen in the congregation whenever this vision was implemented. So he asked things like, where would people sit? And how would coffee hour be expanded so that if someone wanted to bring a dish, their favorite dish, how would that be incorporated into the normal coffee hour, into the coffee hour that's always taking place? What kind of music would we hear, and how would that be different than what we're accustomed to hearing? So they spent a lot of time in leading this change process, going from vision to the practical realities and envisioning it, literally imagining to themselves about the practical realities of what it would mean to actually live out this vision. And so that's a really great example of vision being a picture, a hopeful picture of what things would look like once it was already carried out. So I see that there's some chat. There was some chat happening. I wonder if we can pause and if there are any questions about what we've discussed so far. How do people feel about generating urgency around the need for change? And to a certain extent, the risk involved in that? like some folks are replying, so I definitely want to. Right, concern about panicking people. That's right. I think all of us have heard this idea of leadership, and it's a good idea of leadership, of being the non-anxious presence, right? The the flip side, though, of that is that there should be urgency as well. So how do we generate a sense of urgency without letting it become anxiety? Uh, and I don't honestly know that anyone has complete control over that. You're going to have to be somewhat comfortable with there being some anxiety. Um, I think a big challenge, and I think this is what it's a skillful leader that is able to do this, is that they take that anxiety, they take that urgency, and they hitch it to a positive vision. They use it to say, well, we need to do something. What would this look like if it was different? Um, Nothing to lose is a great point for me to unleash some pending disasters. Okay. All right. Um, I think certainly the part of the point is um, oftentimes in many congregations, crises are already taking place, and we are making explicit and implicit efforts to maybe well-intentioned efforts to hide that from the rest of the community. Um, Sometimes, if we're going to need to make a change, we need to become a little bit more clear about what's happening. Okay, so please continue to ask questions. I'm realizing we are very short on time. I did not anticipate that it would take us before my timing. So let me go very quickly through this. If you have a vision for where you are headed, this vision becomes your primary tool in guiding the congregation and in guiding a working group that will serve to implement this vision. What is a working group? A working group is a group that's brought together for a time, a limited time period. It could be a month to multiple years, but there's a set time period to accomplish a series of specific goals. This is not a committee, which continues to exist in perpetuity. This is a group who has a very, very specific purpose, which is to help make this vision a reality. In recruiting people for this working group, which will help make this vision a reality, know that the shared vision is your best tool for both recruiting and for focusing your teams. You want representation from your stakeholder categories, especially those who make the key decisions, who are responsible for making decisions. So a note I would make here is whereas a visioning team can be a little bit more informal, you're just kind of having conversations with people, a working group is much more formal. It needs to be officially sanctioned. The vestry, the rector needs to be not just, if they're not on the committee itself or some representative is not on the committee itself, they should at least be giving approval and kept in the loop. And then this third point is just a general principle around how teams work. You want to strive for a balance in results, in being results-oriented, process-oriented, and relationships-oriented types of work. Your own role as the team leader shifts. You go from being the person who, the visionary person, the person who's bringing together folks about this exciting idea, to a member of a leadership team or of a working group, and your role shifts in that process. You have to let go a little bit. your role becomes much more about reminding people of what the original vision is. It's about continuing to do the work of building supporters, going back to that first principle that never underestimate the power of inertia. You're always going to have to be convincing people that a major change is needed, and learning to delegate responsibility in this. So let's kind of covered this already, so let's skip that and move here. So we went obviously very quickly through this last section, and I just want to review what we discussed here. We discussed three things: determining an area of change and generating some urgency around that, using that urgency to build a shared vision of where we need to be headed, and then taking the next step of taking that vision and creating a working group to accomplish it. So what would be some next steps from this presentation? First, I think in general is don't go solo. As often as change agents actually are individuals, doing a major change in the congregation requires community work. So bring in God first, and also bring in the wider community. Identify which general area you are primarily concerned about, the organizational level, programmatic, or operational. Identify sources of inertia, build urgency. Literally make a list of your stakeholders. I want you to know that here at ECF, we do follow that template, and we literally make out lists of stakeholders whenever we're talking about change. It's a great tool to figure out who you need to be engaging. Listen for elements of a shared vision, and use that vision to build a working group that will help carry it out. And then, as a change agent yourself, transition from being the primary doer to a team leader. So that slide obviously will be available. Let me move to the discussion then. Well, actually, let's stay here, because there may be people who want to respond to this list in general. So that is a lot of material, and honestly, this is a very complex topic. I think if anyone had a 8-point plan for how to lead change, the world would be a very different place. So it's certainly one of the most complex aspects of leadership, and it's also one of the most needed. So I'm wondering if anyone has any questions or comments about anything we've talked about. Thank you. What if the team you build goes off in another direction and you don't agree?
Fire.
Oftentimes, well, A, that happens, and B, one of the most important roles I think that the team leader has is herding the cats back to the vision and reminding people over and over, this is the world that we're working toward. This is the picture of the world that we're working toward. It's not like how we actually implement it, we may not agree, we may all have different ideas, but if your role continues to be realigning to the vision, that's really important. I do that with my colleagues as well. We spend occasionally we'll spend some time literally just going over what are the impacts that ECF wants to achieve, and spending 30 minutes discussing in depth. What does that look like? What would that look like for our world? Just to remind us all, this is where we should be concentrating our creativity in.
And of course, the key with that, which was actually part of what we were talking about in the communications for parish leaders web conference that was led by Nancy Dabbage last week, was about those lines of communication, how leaders are communicating in the congregation, and it's that part, which if you haven't seen that, I would recommend flipping over sometime later to watch that recording, is where a lot of the conflict can come up from that, because if this team has gone off in a different direction, and there hasn't been the good communication between the leadership in the church, and then you're presented with this thing 6 months later, and you're kind of like, what the heck is this? And that's going to cause more of a crisis. Instead of being able to work, as Miguel was saying, with your teams, and talking about returning to what's the vision, what's our purpose for doing this, so if you haven't seen that, I'd recommend checking out that webinar.
Person has a really, I think, good point, which is, what are some markers or criteria that equals change is impossible with this church? When do you move to graceful closure? I think, first of all, great question. And I think there are certainly congregations in which change is more of an uphill battle than others. Especially in the sort of change process that we're describing, which is collaborative. It really implies a willingness on the part of multiple parties, including the core leaders, to kind of entertain the possibility of change. That in certain places that's not the case, and I think change becomes almost, I'm not going to say impossible, but very near impossible if the key decision makers, the rector, for instance, or the entire vestry, is unified in being absolutely against any possible change. I'm not sure that there is actually a church in which is completely unified in being against change. It's very likely that there would be people on the vestry, maybe the rector has a dream that hasn't been voiced, that would be interested. But certainly, especially this sort of collaborative change really does assume a certain willingness to kind of play along to a certain extent, and to see what happens.
Turn on the light.
Okay. Well, Brendan, why don't we close this out?
Okay. Well, thank you again for everybody for attending, and we'll definitely value your feedback on this. For everyone who's participated this evening, you'll have a web link. You will have an email from us with a link to a survey. We encourage you and would really appreciate if you took a moment to fill that out. Your feedback is very important to us. This helps us to be able to make our own changes with this web conference, as well as our future web conferences. So if you please take a moment. Also, please contact us with your questions. We know we have a couple others that we didn't quite get around to this evening. We are happy to talk to you about the questions that you have in your congregation and have more of a conversation. Miguel, Nancy Dabbage, who edits ECF Auto Practices, or myself are all happy to talk to you. So please get in touch with us or any our other colleagues at the Episcopal Church Foundation. And with that, we wish you Godspeed in your changes and in your ministry and your congregations, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.